All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we've got a really complex stack of sources that pull us into what feels like a necessary but often, painful contradiction.
It really is.
We're basically mapping the space between possibility and reality,
Mm.
between the deep human yearning for a coherent, supported adult life for autistic and AuDHD individuals, and, well, the current landscape of systemic failure and, frankly, financial exploitation.
And that mapping is so crucial for you, the listener, because our sources today, they're less interested in just pointing fingers. They're more focused on tracing the mechanisms of harm.
The mechanics, right?
Yeah, we're unpacking what they call the cartography of absence, what happens when regulatory bodies just fail to act, when media attention fades, and how that void becomes the very thing that keeps the community so economically precarious.
Okay, let's unpack this then, because the material starts with a stunning blueprint. It forces you to visualize this ideal road out of childhood.
And it's not some fantasy.
No, not at all. It's a simple, ethical definition of an adult life lived among others, instead of, constantly struggling in spite of them.
It's such a powerful foundation to start with. The sources define this aspirational state, this ideal of coherence, through, I think, 3 core components.
Okay.
So first, life is held firmly in community, a real sense of belonging. Second, the person finds meaningful work that genuinely fits their temperament.
Where accommodation is just the baseline, not something you have to fight for.
Exactly. And the third component, it speaks to authenticity. Friendships are gathered slowly by real affinity, not this sort of forced socialization.
The kind of relationships that actually sustain you instead of draining you. But for me, the most affecting detail in this whole vision is the physical relief it implies.
Absolutely. The sources touch on that constant, exhausting physical and mental toll of masking, of just navigating a non-accommodating world.
And in this coherent vision,
the body doesn't have to constantly brace against existence. Just think about that for a second.
yeah, removing that constant psychological readiness for failure or for overwhelm, if you take away that chronic day-to-day strain, the noise, the sheer energetic cost of just surviving.
What's left is what they call coherence.
It's not about being cured or normalized. It's about integrating yourself into a world that actually respects your difference. It's the stability that lets you grow.
And what's so fascinating here is that the sources use this ideal not just as a nice thought exercise. They use it as a direct weapon against the current system.
How so?
By presenting this baseline expectation of dignity and support, they immediately frame the reality for most autistic and AuDHD adults as a profound ethical failure. This coherence is the thing that's structurally absent, and that absence, they argue, is engineered.
That sets the table perfectly for what comes next, because the sources pull us sharply from that ideal into the reality of systemic neglect, what they call the quiet violence of the state just looking away.
And they use a powerful, very recent example of regulatory failure right after media scrutiny to make their point.
This is where it gets really interesting.
The focus shifts to specific instances where, serious journalistic work exposed these huge ethical and evidence gaps in certain high-cost interventions.
Okay.
The sources cite a period where 2 major Los Angeles Times articles were published, and they were separated by more than a year.
And these weren't like sensationalist hit pieces.
Not at all. They were measured, they cited medical experts, they documented the lack of evidence for certain models of care, and they raised very clear ethical alarms.
And the critique is stunningly direct. The articles did their job. They showed the cracks in the system. They clearly identified where money was flowing into these unproven, sometimes harmful services designed to change or, normalize behavior.
Right, rather than support neurodivergent individuals.
Exactly.
But here is the critical failure. This is where we start tracing that regulatory inertia. After all this high-profile scrutiny, after the problems were meticulously named and documented,
Nothing happened.
Nothing of substance. We saw no new enforcement, no legislative shift, and crucially, no interruption of the underlying financial machinery that was driving these practices.
So you have a clear map of the problem, you have expert testimony, and yet the machine just keeps spinning. Does the source material give us any insight into why the regulators, whose job is protection, essentially just sat on their hands?
It suggests the failure isn't accidental. It's a symptom of a much broader societal function. This is where we get that powerful critique.
Which is?
That vulture capitalism survives scrutiny, not by disproving its critics, but by outlasting their attention.
Wow. So the machinery of extraction doesn't need to win the ethical argument.
It just needs the news cycle to move on.
That is chilling. The cost of advocacy is so high, and once that energy fades, the system just defaults back to business as usual. So the problem isn't just named and exposed, it's then politely but deliberately left intact.
Yes. The documentation itself becomes the end of the story, not the start of the solution.
And that mechanism documentation over enforcement, that drills right down into the daily lives of families.
It does. We're talking about treatments, often these intensive behavioral models rooted in, decades-old discredited philosophies that promise to mold a child into a closer approximation of neurotypicality.
The source calls this approach experimental certainty. That phrase just hits so hard.
It really does.
It implies these interventions are given with this absolute, completely unearned confidence, even while the scientific community is raising serious questions about their efficacy and ethics.
The certainty is experimental, but as you said, the financial extraction is 100% guaranteed. The clinics stay open.
The invoices keep coming.
Exactly. Time passes, and hundreds of thousands of dollars are siphoned away. Money that could have been used to actually support the long-term independence and stability of that family.
And then that burden, as the sources emphasize, is forced entirely onto the family themselves. They're told that caveat emptor buyer beware is an adequate safeguard.
How can it be? How can it be adequate when the entire landscape is designed to confuse and overwhelm you?
It's an impossible scenario.
It is. Imagine you're a parent, you're desperate and terrified, you're navigating complex insurance, dealing with conflicting diagnoses, and you're just bombarded by these highly confident, commercially driven treatment centers.
The source argues the landscape is deliberately designed to overwhelm discernment.
Desperate hope makes the perfect target for speculative interventions.
Which brings us back to that central, terrible question about the role of the state. If they're documenting the harm, but not interrupting the financial flow, what are they actually doing?
Well, the source puts it very clearly. The state watches, documents, and steps aside.
Wow.
The analysis concludes that autism just becomes another site where harm is acknowledged in retrospect, through the articles and the critique, but it's effectively permitted in advance by the absence of regulation.
It's an economic policy disguised as ethical inaction. That acknowledgement of harm without interrupting the financial machinery is the core thesis here. We focused a lot on the interventions for children, but the sources then make this crucial pivot. What about the long-term fate of the adults these children become?
And this is where the material provides its most acute social critique. The very people who were theoretically being helped, the autistic and AuDHD children, they're growing up into a community defined by intense precarity.
Detail that precarity for us. What does it look like day to day for the adults who are basically a footnote in this whole conversation?
It looks like chronic exhaustion. It looks like being massively underemployed. And not for lack of skill, but because workplaces refuse to accommodate basic neurodivergent needs.
So they're living precariously.
Constantly priced out of any kind of long-term stability housing, reliable transport, consistent health care. The economy simply hasn't made space for them.
So we have these two realities running in parallel, and this is where that massive contradiction lies. On one hand, you have thousands of autistic and AuDHD adults fighting for basic survival.
For housing, for rest, for medical care.
Right, because the economic structure has systematically excluded them.
And on the other hand, the very same system allows tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes hundreds of thousands per child, to be siphoned into speculative, often behaviorally punitive interventions.
It's a literal resource transfer from potential adult stability to immediate unproven intervention.
Exactly. The money is extracted by clinics that just outlast the scrutiny.
So what does this all mean when you look at that massive financial disparity? I mean, the resource gap is huge, but the source material doesn't use sterile language like disproportionate funding. They use a very charged word to describe this failure.
They call the entire mechanism obscene.
Obscene.
And they use that word very precisely because it highlights the moral failure of how we allocate resources. The system allows vast sums of money to chase these dubious cures while simultaneously refusing to fund the foundational supports.
The housing, the employment training, the robust community care.
All the things that would actually grant stability and dignity and that initial vision of coherence to adults.
So it's the sheer waste of resources paired against the undeniable, documented need of the adult community that earns that label.
Yes. The economic precarity of the adults is the direct consequence of the regulatory absence we were talking about earlier. If you connect this back to that initial ideal of coherence, The message is clear.
Which is?
True support means interrupting this financial extraction machine and redirecting those funds toward creating an accommodating world. It means finally acknowledging that accommodation, not normalization, is the ethical path forward.
So to recap the key takeaway for you, the learner. This deep dive shows us a systemic function. Scrutiny of harmful practices doesn't lead to fundamental change.
No, it just leads to documentation.
Which then allows the financial mechanisms of exploitation, the vulture capitalism, to just outlast any critical public attention. The lack of regulatory action becomes the engine of harm.
And for a final provocative thought, we have to consider the long game here. We've traced this system that treats children's nervous systems as speculative terrain.
Yeah.
What is the true cost of failing to interrupt this machinery? It's not just the immediate financial hit to the family, it's the creation of an entire generation of chronically exhausted, underemployed adults who were denied the chance for coherence simply because the system prioritized documentation over intervention.
The cost of acknowledging the problem is low. The cost of permitting it is human devastation.
Exactly.
A truly profound and necessary critique. We encourage you to consider how our societal systems decide which harms are merely worth documenting for a public record, and which are worth actively permitting to continue running through their financial pipelines. That's all for this deep dive.